Section 38 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19, Colonial and Foreign Policy, the Dominion of Canada, Part 2. A government which could in one session place upon the statute book two such measures as the Reform Act of 1867 and the British North America Act had good reason to congratulate itself on its legislative record. Ministers were not less fortunate in their management of foreign affairs. The sequence of events which culminated in the 7 Weeks' War of 1866 has been indicated in a previous chapter. The rapid and overwhelming success achieved by the armies of Prussia took the world by storm. But the Prussian victory did more than exclude Austria from Germany. It profoundly affected the balance of power in Europe. France, in particular, was quick to realize its significance. In the autumn of 1865, the Emperor Napoleon and Bismarck had met in friendly conference in Biarritz. The French Emperor had then fallen an easy prey to the disarming bluntness of the German diplomatist. At Biarritz, Bismarck had secured Napoleon's benevolent neutrality in the coming struggle with Austria by the promise, not too definite, of territorial compensation, perhaps a Rhine province or Luxembourg, or even Belgium. Napoleon had swallowed the bait and had allowed Bismarck to make his plans for the destruction of Austria. But the rapid and complete success of Prussia entirely upset his calculations. He imagined, as did everyone else, that the contest would be prolonged and indecisive, and that after the exhaustion of both combatants he would be able to step in and secure the appropriate reward of a benevolent and impartial arbitrator. Instead of this, he found himself at the close of the brief but decisive conflict a humble suitor to Bismarck for an unconsidered trifle. His first suggestion was the Rhenish Palatinate. Bismarck laughed in his face and sent the correspondence to Bavaria, to whom the Palatinate belonged. The only result was to detach from France an hereditary friend and to cement a Prusso-Bavarian alliance which proved its value in 1870. A demand for Belgium, perhaps stimulated by Bismarck himself, had no better results for Napoleon, but was equally convenient for Bismarck. The correspondence, published at the psychological moment in 1870, served to alienate English sympathies from their whilom ally. Luxembourg remained. The situation of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg was peculiar. An integral part of the Germanic Confederation, it was ruled by the King of Holland, whose possession of the Grand Duchy was guaranteed by a treaty concluded in April 1839 between Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. Its capital was a fortress of the first class, and the Grand Duchy occupied a strategic position of great importance. The presence of a Prussian garrison was a disquieting fact for Holland and Belgium, and a real menace to France. Foiled elsewhere by Bismarck, Napoleon opened negotiations with William of Holland as Grand Duke for the purchase of Luxembourg. The Grand Duke was not unwilling, but the Dutch cabinet appealed to Prussia, who referred them to the Treaty of 1839. The position of the signatory powers was thus directly challenged, and in May a conference met in London. The tact and caution of Lord Stanley, backed by the Queen's personal intervention with the King of Prussia, brought about a speedy and satisfactory settlement. The Prussian garrison was to be withdrawn, the fortifications of the city of Luxembourg were to be demolished, no military establishment was to be maintained or created there for the future, and the Grand Duchy itself was to be neutralized under the joint guarantee of the five powers. An awkward corner had been skillfully turned. It would not have turned so easily had Bismarck been quite ready for the inevitable war. But if he was not ready, still less was Napoleon. The latter, baffled on every side, now tried to persuade himself and his friends that no territorial compensation was really necessary, and that Prussia had been in reality weakened rather than strengthened by recent events. The accuracy of his diagnosis was to be tested by happenings not distant. Meanwhile, his own prestige suffered a further and staggering blow from the defeat, capture, and execution of his protege, the unhappy Emperor Maximilian, in Mexico, June 19, 1867. After a session unusually arduous and prolonged, Parliament was prorogued on August 21st. The royal speech contained an ominous reference to communications to the reigning monarch of Abyssinia, with a view to obtain the release of the British subjects whom he detains in his dominions. These communications proved ineffectual, and in less than 3 months' time the two Houses were summoned to meet for the purpose of making provision for an armed expedition to effect the release of the captives at Magdala. The events which led up to this dénouement must be briefly related. The story is typical of English relations with semi-civilized potentates and peoples. An English traveller, Mr. Plowden, reported to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, on the opening for English trade and on the opportunity for philanthropic effort offered by a neglected portion of the surface of the great subtropical continent. Caught by the idea of extending British interests, and at the same time of curtailing the traffic in slaves, Lord Palmerston appointed Mr. Plowden consul at Massawa, 1848. Not content with his routine functions in the island, Mr. Plowden plunged into the domestic politics of Abyssinia. For some 10 years he was the right-hand man of the chief king or negus of Abyssinia. The latter, King Theodore, an ambitious potentate, who claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, desired the assistance of the Great White Queen against his Egyptian enemies who threatened him on the north, and the Turks who were troublesome neighbours on the east. Plowden was killed in a fray in 1860, and a Captain Cameron was appointed to succeed him. Lord John Russell was less expansive than Lord Palmerston in his interpretation of consular duties. He peremptorily forbid Consul Cameron to meddle in the domestic politics of Abyssinia, and ordered him to attend to his own business, or rather that of his employers, at Massawa. But King Theodore was still sanguine as to the results of an alliance with England, and in 1862 addressed a personal letter to the Queen requesting that he might be allowed to send a mission to Her Majesty's court. By an error destined to be costly, Lord Russell left the letter unanswered, contenting himself with renewed orders to Consul Cameron to mind his own business. Unluckily for himself and for his country, Cameron disobeyed orders, and in 1864 Theodore, impatient for an answer and deeply resentful of the slight involved in the neglect of his overtures, flung Consul Cameron and all the Europeans within his reach into captivity in the rock fortress of Magdala. Between this capital and the coast lay 400 miles of mountainous and trackless country. A formal mission under Lieutenant Prideaux and Mr. Ransome, a Syrian Christian in the English service, was dispatched to Magdala to demand the relief of the captives. But King Theodore was defiant, and the only result of the mission was that Prideaux and Ransome joined the band of captives in Magdala. The matter now began to assume a serious aspect. The number of captives was insignificant, not more than 30 in all, but 3 of them were British subjects, and of these 2 at least had been entrapped in the execution of their duties as official representatives of the British government. To repeated remonstrances and requests, King Theodore paid no heed, and in the spring of 1867 Lord Stanley sent an ultimatum to Magdala. A preliminary survey of the ground which an expeditionary force would have to traverse was made, and in August of 1867 the government determined to dispatch it. Abyssinia was treated as within the sphere of Indian politics. Bombay was selected as the base of the operation, and Sir Robert Napier, Commander-in-Chief at Bombay, was appointed to the command. No better choice could have been made. In January 1868 Napier landed near Massawa at the head of a force of 12,000 men, of whom 2/3 were drawn from the Indian Army. The main difficulties ahead were those of country, climate, and transport, but no risks were taken. The whole expedition was scientifically planned and carried through with an exemplary attention to detail. By April 1868 Napier and an advanced force found themselves before Magdala, and on the 10th they swept aside the only serious opposition they encountered. 500 of the enemy were killed and 1,500 were wounded. 19 Englishmen were wounded, but not one was killed. Theodore then released the captives unharmed, but refused to surrender his capital. Napier was accordingly compelled to storm a fortress of immense natural strength. The assault was entirely successful. Theodore died by his own hand, and Magdala was destroyed. Napier's task was accomplished. British honour was vindicated. The captives were free. Within a week the expedition was on its way back to the coast. Abyssinia was left severely alone. The army received the thanks of Parliament, and its commander was raised to the peerage as Baron Napier of Magdala. The compliments were well deserved. The scale of the expedition was relatively small, but the skill with which it was planned and the precision with which it was carried through reflect the highest credit upon the commander and his subordinates. A considerable portion of the cost was charged, not without protest from Mr. Henry Fawcett, upon the revenues of India, but even so the British taxpayer had to find £8,000,000 to extricate a meddlesome consul from a pit digged by himself. Before General Napier had reached Magdala, a change of some significance had taken place in the English ministry. Lord Derby resigned office in February 1868, and Vivian Grey reigned in his stead. That Disraeli should be the next Premier was, after his long and brilliant services to his party, inevitable. That he should ever have been called or permitted to render those services may well seem inexplicable. The changes in the Cabinet consequential upon Lord Derby's retirement were few. Lord Chelmsford was dismissed from the Woolsack, without, as he complained, even the usual month's notice, to make room for Sir Hugh Cairns, one of the greatest lawyers and one of the most eminent statesmen who ever filled that high office. Disraeli was replaced at the Exchequer by Mr. George Ward Hunt, a Tory squire, with a fund of common sense and an excellent head for business. Lord Derby survived his retirement little more than a year. His death in 1869 removed from the stage almost the last of the early Victorian veterans. A devoted churchman, an excellent scholar, a successful translator of Homer, appropriately commemorated in the university of which he was Chancellor by a scholarship which is the guerdon of pure classical attainment, a brilliant debater and a sound administrator, Lord Derby never attained to the first rank of statesmanship. His best official work was done before he reached middle life, as Irish Secretary under Lord Grey, and at the Colonial Office under Grey and Peel. As leader of the Conservative party, circumstances were against him. He stood for protection in the heyday of the Manchester School, and although he was thrice Prime Minister of England, he was never in power. To his immediate successor he bequeathed no easy task. For about 10 months Disraeli remained in office, but as long as the session lasted, until July 30th, it was Gladstone who was in power. Reform bills for Scotland and Ireland were, as already indicated, added to the statute book with the assent of both parties. Apart from this, Disraeli could do little to guide the course of legislation. It was Gladstone who proposed and carried a bill for the abolition of compulsory church rates. It was Gladstone who carried against the whole strength of the government a resolution in favour of the disestablishment of the established church in Ireland. That resolution marks the opening of a new epoch in the history of Ireland and a new chapter in that of England. End of section 38. Section 39 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 20. The Irish Question. Ecclesiastical, Agrarian, Political. Part 1. From the days of Queen Elizabeth to those of Queen Victoria, the Irish problem has resolved itself into three main factors: the constitutional relations of the larger and the smaller island, the existence in Ireland of an established Protestant Church, powerless to conciliate the affection or even the goodwill of a population devoted to Roman Catholicism, and an agrarian system alien in origin, feudal in legal theory, and superimposed upon tribal institutions, deep-rooted in the memory and the instincts of the people. With all these factors, British statesmen found themselves compelled to deal during the last decades of the 19th century. The problem had already been attacked in fragmentary fashion in the first half of the century. The removal of Roman Catholic disabilities, 1829, the Church Temporalities Act, 1833, the Maynooth Act, 1845, the foundation of the Queen's Colleges, 1845, the appointment of a commission under the chairmanship of Lord Devon to inquire into the land question, 1843, the Encumbered Estates Act of 1849, the repeal movement under O'Connell, 1833 et sequentes, the Young Ireland movement culminating in the abortive rebellion of 1848, all these testified to the existence of a problem or a sheaf of problems still unsolved. Between the fiasco of 1848 and the Fenian conspiracy, 1865 to 1867, there was a calm almost continuous in Irish politics. It was the calm, however, not of placid happiness and contentment, but of exhaustion and despair. Of exhaustion due to the famine and the exodus, of despair after the abortive rebellion of 1848. But though the surface was unruffled, there was in old Ireland an unceasing groundswell of discontent, and in the new Ireland, which gradually grew up on the other side of the Atlantic, there was an acute and dangerous agitation. In that agitation, Fenianism had its birth. For the 20 years after the outbreak of Fenianism, 1865 to 1887, the Irish question was never permitted to slumber. In Parliament, legislative proposals of great complexity and importance almost continuously occupied attention. In Ireland, symptoms of unrest and disloyalty manifested themselves with alarming frequency and baffled the efforts of well-meaning administrators. Essentially, the problem was the same as that which had distracted English councils for 3 centuries. It revolved around the land, the church, and the constitutional relations. The first guise under which the perennial problem obtruded itself was that of Fenianism. The genesis of the movement, which with characteristic felicity adopted this Celtic label, footnote, the Fenians were the warriors who in the prehistoric days of Irish legend followed the great tribal monarchs, end footnote, is to be found in the exodus which followed close upon the great famine. Not all the benevolent, though sometimes misdirected activities of English administrators could induce Irishmen to regard the famine otherwise than as a crime perpetrated by England against Ireland. Coroners' juries were but re-echoing the sentiment of the people at large when they brought in verdicts of wilful murder against John Russell, commonly called Lord John Russell. In 1841, the population of Ireland was 8,175,124. It is now less than 4,500,000, and it is undeniable that for good or ill it was the famine which gave the initial impetus to this depopulation movement. In the half-decade between 1846 and 1851, nearly 1 million people died in Ireland, and over 1 million people left the country. In the decade between 1852 and 1861, another million, 1,123,000, emigrated and found a home for the most part in the states of the American Union. How well they prospered and how tenderly their hearts turned toward the Ireland they had left behind is attested by the fact that between 1848 and 1864 the Irish Americans sent home a sum of no less than £13,000,000 to enable their relatives to follow them to the United States. Among the Irish emigrants were not a few fiercer spirits who nourished feelings of bitter resentment against the stern stepmother who, as they believed, had made them exiles from their native land. These men kept alive the revolutionary temper in Ireland itself, and in many parts of the country, particularly in the small towns of the south and west, secret societies were established. In May 1858, James Stephens, one of the survivors of the 48 who had for years been in exile, visited the little town of Skibbereen in the county Cork. At Skibbereen, Jeremiah Donovan, afterwards known as Donovan Rossa, and other young men had lately founded the Phoenix National and Literary Society. The aims of the society were revolutionary. Its members were pledged to work for the establishment of an independent republic on Irish soil. The meetings and drillings which they organized in the west of Ireland were well known to the government, and in December 1858 20 leading members of the society were suddenly arrested. A special commission was issued for the trial of the prisoners. One of them was sentenced to a long term of penal servitude. The others, after some months' imprisonment, were liberated on bail. The Phoenix conspiracy was scotched in Ireland, but operations were transferred to the other side of the Atlantic. While James Stephens was busy in fomenting conspiracy in Ireland, another survivor of the 48, John O'Mahony, was actively organizing the Fenian Brotherhood in America. The society was skillfully organized. Each member was acquainted only with his immediate superior in the hierarchy. Secrecy was maintained and obedience was implicit. The close of the American Civil War, 1865, gave the signal as it offered the opportunity for the opening of the Fenian attack. In that war had fought on both sides thousands of Irish Americans. Some had attained distinction, all had gained experience. That experience they were now burning to utilize in a cause more immediately their own. Meanwhile, the English government had kept under close observation the doings of the Brotherhood in Ireland. In September 1865, the Dublin police raided the offices of the Irish People, a paper devoted to the propaganda of Fenianism. They arrested the proprietor Donovan, and the directors seized the plant and suppressed the paper. Shortly afterwards, Stephens also was arrested, but through the connivance of Fenian jailers he effected his escape from Richmond prison. He remained in hiding for some months in Dublin, and was then smuggled out of the country and was never recaptured. Meanwhile, Donovan and his associates were arraigned before a special commission on a charge of treason felony and were sentenced to long terms of penal servitude. That they were engaged in a conspiracy to subvert the government of the country is not open to question. After their arrest, the police discovered abundant evidence that it was widespread and might become formidable. In February 1866, the Irish executive, Lord Woodhouse, afterwards Earl of Kimberley, Lord Chancellor Brady, and Mr. Chichester Fortescue came to the conclusion that they could no longer be responsible for the government of the country unless they were entrusted with exceptional powers. The Cabinet concurred, and on February 17th, 1866, an Act for the suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act was passed through both Houses and received the royal assent. Events proved that the apprehensions of the Castle were well founded, nor can it be doubted that the prompt action of the government averted both danger and suffering from Ireland. the Irish Americans hastily decamped to pursue their activity elsewhere. As far as Ireland was concerned, Fenianism was scotched if not killed. In February 1867 there was an attempted insurrection in County Kerry, and for a month or two there were sporadic outbreaks in different parts of Ireland, but the movement never attained serious dimensions. Some 300 Fenians were arrested, put on trial for felony or treason felony, and 2 of the leaders were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, but no one actually suffered death. Ireland, however, was not the main theatre of Fenianism. A few months after Donovan and his companions had passed into the obscurity of penal servitude, 1,200 of their brethren raided the Canadian frontier, crossed the Niagara River, and occupied Fort Erie. The success of the enterprise depended entirely, of course, on the measure of sympathy and support it might obtain from the United States. Of support it received none. The behavior of the Washington government was disappointingly correct, strict neutrality was enforced, and the Canadian volunteers and police did the rest. The main body of raiders was driven back across the frontier. 6 of the leaders were captured, tried by court-martial, and shot. No further trouble was experienced in Canada. Such importance as Fenianism really possessed lay in its influence upon English opinion. That influence was powerfully exerted by the events of 1867. The alarms were frequent throughout the year. Of the first of the series, Chester was the scene. The castle contained 9,000 stands of arms, 4,000 swords, 900,000 rounds of ammunition, besides a large amount of powder in bulk, and the armory of the militia and volunteers. It was garrisoned by half a dozen soldiers of the 54th Regiment. It is supposed that the plan was to seize the castle, to carry off the stores, arms, and ammunition, to cut the telegraph wires and tear up the rails, then make all speed for Holyhead, seize some vessels in the harbour, and descend upon the Irish coast. Had it not been for the promptitude of the police, magistrates, and citizens of Chester, the plan might have succeeded, and the country would have incurred ridicule, if not danger. From the early hours of Monday, February 11th, bands of young men from 18 to 25 years of age, and apparently of the labouring and operative class, began to pour into the city by train from Liverpool, Preston, Manchester, Halifax, and other neighbouring towns. By Monday evening there were said to be 1,500 of them in the city. The authorities in Chester acted with admirable promptitude. By 1 o'clock on the afternoon of Monday, a company of the 54th Regiment arrived from Manchester. The volunteers and other citizens were enrolled as special constables. Lord Grosvenor left London by the mail on Monday night, and put himself at the head of his Cheshire Yeomanry on Tuesday morning, and at 10:45 a.m. on the Tuesday, February 12th, a battalion of Scots Fusiliers arrived by special train from Euston. After the arrival of this strong reinforcement, the citizens of Chester breathed again. The mysterious strangers disappeared as quickly as they had come, and by Tuesday evening the scare was at an end. Some of the Chester visitors may have taken boat for Ireland. At any rate, 70 suspected Fenians were arrested on their arrival in Dublin on board the Alexandra from Holyhead and the St. Columbia from Liverpool on the morning of February the 13th. On the 14th there was a rising in County Kerry, and for 24 hours there was much alarm at Killarney. But on the arrival of reinforcements the Fenians took to the mountains, and on Friday evening, February 15th, the Times correspondent was able to telegraph from Dublin, "All danger is over and the country quiet." In the autumn of the same year, 1867, Manchester was the scene of a Fenian outrage of exceptional audacity. Early in September, the Manchester police had arrested 2 men suspected of intent to commit a felony, and subsequently identified as 2 notorious Fenian officers, Colonel Kelly and Captain Deasy. On the 18th they were remanded by the magistrates, and as they were being taken back to jail, the prison van was attacked by a band of 40 to 50 Fenians armed with revolvers. Police Sergeant Brett, in charge of the van, behaved with the utmost gallantry, refused to surrender his keys or his prisoners, and was killed by a shot fired through the lock. Others were wounded. The rescue was successful. Kelly and Deasy made good their escape, but of the rescuers, 29 were ultimately arrested. 5 men, William O'Meara Allen, Michael Larkin, William Gould, Thomas Maguire, and Edwin Shore, were put upon their trial for the murder of Sergeant Brett. All 5 were convicted and sentenced to death. Maguire and Shore were subsequently reprieved, but on November 23rd the other 3 suffered the extreme penalty of the law. The trial and the execution excited an unusual amount of interest. The youth of the prisoners, the audacity of the deed for which they were to suffer, the absence of any murderous intent, the sorrow expressed by all for the fate of their innocent victim Brett, their courageous demeanour in the dock, the vigorous agitation for a reprieve, the apprehension of an insurrection on a serious scale, all combined to invest the trial and execution of the Manchester martyrs with a halo of romance and to remove from the ordinary category the crime for which they forfeited their lives. That the forfeiture was just, none can deny, but the murder which in law they committed was neither intentional nor sordid, and the sentiment which still surrounds their memory in Ireland is, if not admirable, at least intelligible. The execution of the Fenians at Manchester was followed early in December by a number of demonstrations in honour of the martyrs at Manchester itself, at Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Mitchelstown, and other Irish towns. Much more important, however, than these demonstrations in its ultimate results was the attempt to liberate 2 Fenian prisoners from the Clerkenwell House of Detention. Planned by the same organization as the Manchester outrage, the Clerkenwell explosion differed from it in its callous indifference to human life. Here, as at Chester, the authorities were warned, but in this case they culpably failed to avert the attack. On the afternoon of December 13th, a terrible explosion occurred in Corporation Row, overlooking Clerkenwell Jail. A considerable length of the prison wall was blown down. Houses in the vicinity were destroyed. Several persons were killed outright. Several others died from shock, and about 100 were more or less severely injured. A number of persons were charged with treason felony, and 1 man was ultimately hanged. The scare at Chester, the sporadic outbreaks in Ireland, the audacious outrages in Manchester and London operated powerfully upon public opinion. On the one hand, there was an unflinching determination to maintain public order, but on the other there was an increasing disposition to inquire whether the Fenian movement, though undeniably criminal in itself, might not be the outcome of a discontent at once legitimate and remediable. One eminent statesman was, as the sequel will show, converted to this view. The government, however, were not in a position to deal effectually with any subtle or difficult problem. Mr. Disraeli was in office on sufferance, and the debates in both houses soon made him acutely conscious of the fact. The first business of Parliament after the Christmas recess was to renew the suspension of the Habeas Corpus Act in Ireland. There was, however, a consensus of opinion that remedies at once more drastic and more curative would have to be applied. Speaking at Bristol in January, Lord Stanley, whose position in the government was second only to that of Disraeli, had declared with emphasis that Ireland is the question of the hour. Its material condition was not bad, yet it would be idle to deny that discontent is very widely spread, that disaffection is not infrequent, and that there is a portion of the population who regard their connection with England as a burden rather than a benefit. On March 16th, Lord Mayo, the Chief Secretary, made to the House a statement of ministerial policy. Like Lord Stanley, he admitted that despite a marked increase of material prosperity, there was much disaffection and even disloyalty. To Fenianism he attached little importance. It was not a native but an American product. The government intended to bring forward an Irish Reform Bill, a promise speedily fulfilled, a land bill dealing with compensation for improvements, extended forms of leasing for limited owners, and the encouragement of written contracts between landlords and tenants, a measure for the more efficient management of Irish railways, and another for the improvement of elementary education and the establishment of a Roman Catholic university. They also proposed to appoint a commission to inquire into the relations between landlord and tenant in Ireland. As to the most difficult question of all, the position of the established Church in Ireland, the government intended to await the report of the commission appointed in 1867 at the instance of Lord Russell. But neither on this nor on the land question could a satisfactory settlement be obtained by confiscation. Policy and justice might demand the equalization of church establishments in Ireland, and Protestants were not disinclined to consider any fair proposal for that purpose. But it must be done by the process of levelling upwards, not downwards. The destruction of the Irish Church would not conciliate one enemy, while it would alienate many friends. What precisely did Lord Mayo mean by levelling upwards and not downwards? It was generally taken to point toward concurrent endowment, though the interpretation was subsequently repudiated. But whatever it meant, Mr. Gladstone would have none of it. He definitely told the House that, in his opinion, the time had come when the Anglican Church in Ireland must cease to exist as an establishment, and the principle of religious equality must be definitely accepted. His mind had for some time been moving in this direction. In 1865, 1866, and 1867, the House had been asked to consider the question, and on the last occasion Gladstone declared that the time is not far distant when the Parliament of England will feel it its duty to look this question fully and fairly in the face. It was not. On March 23, 1868, Mr. Gladstone gave notice of his intention to move 3 resolutions on the subject. The terms of the resolutions were as follows: 1. That in the opinion of this House it is necessary that the established Church of Ireland should cease to exist as an establishment, due regard being had to all personal interests and to all individual rights of property. 2. That subject to the foregoing considerations, it is expedient to prevent the creation of new personal interests by the exercise of any public patronage, and to confine the operation of the Ecclesiastical Commissioners of Ireland to objects of immediate necessity or involving individual rights pending a final decision of Parliament. 3. That an humble address be presented to Her Majesty, humbly to pray that, with a view to the purposes aforesaid, Her Majesty will be graciously pleased to place at the disposal of Parliament her interest in the temporalities and archbishoprics, bishoprics, and other ecclesiastical dignities and benefices in Ireland, and in the custody thereof. The Prime Minister at once agreed to afford facilities for the discussion of the resolutions, and on March 30th Mr. Gladstone moved that the House should go into committee to consider them. As an amendment, Lord Stanley moved that the question ought to be reserved for the decision of a new Parliament. The amendment was defeated by a majority of 60, 330 to 270. Gladstone's motion was affirmed by a majority of 56, and exactly a month later, April 30th, the first resolution was carried by 330 votes against 265. The significance of this vote was clearly apprehended by Disraeli's ministry, and on May 4th the Prime Minister made a formal, though not an unambiguous, announcement as to their position. He told the House that he had placed the resignation of his ministry at the disposal of the Queen, and had suggested the alternative of a dissolution, that the Queen had refused to accept the resignation, but had promised to dissolve Parliament, as soon as the interests of public business would permit. The announcement was received with marked disfavour. Gladstone hotly denied the right of the Ministry to force a dissolution, and deprecated the use made by Disraeli of the Queen's name. He was, in fact, all impatience to go through with the work to which he had now set his hand, and to the general principle of which the House of Commons had already assented. That the new constituencies, just coming to the birth, had not been consulted in this or any other question seemed to him a matter of secondary importance. It was ultimately agreed, however, that the registration should be expedited and an election held on the new register in November. To the second and third resolutions practically no opposition was offered, but the House awaited with some curiosity the answer which the Queen would be advised to make to the third. It was promptly forthcoming, May 12th, and proved to be entirely correct. "Relying," says the Queen, "on the wisdom of my Parliament, I desire that my interests in the temporalities of the United Church of England and Ireland in Ireland may not stand in the way of the consideration by Parliament of any measure relating thereto in the present session." Thereupon Mr. Gladstone, in accordance with the terms of the third resolution, immediately, May 14th, introduced a bill suspending until August 1st, 1869, the exercise of the public ecclesiastical patronage in Ireland. The second reading was carried 312 to 258 before the month was out, and the bill, after slight amendment, was sent up to the Lords. There, after a brilliant debate in which Lord Derby took an animated part, the bill was rejected by a majority of 95, 192 to 97. The decision on the whole matter would now rest with the new electorate. The verdict was pronounced with the least possible delay. Parliament was dissolved by proclamation on November 11th, and before the end of the month Demos had spoken. In the event, the Liberals found themselves in a majority of 115 to 120 in the new House of Commons. Gladstone failed to secure re-election in South West Lancashire, but had taken the precaution to be nominated for Greenwich, where he was returned. Lord Hartington was defeated in North Lancashire and had to take refuge in Wales. Disraeli accepted the verdict of the constituencies as final and did not await the meeting of Parliament before placing his resignation in the hands of the Queen December 1st. The man who had shot Niagara was not afraid of setting a democratic precedent, and it is undeniable that by prompt resignation he consulted both his own dignity and the interests of the country. It was high time that the minister in office should also be in power. The Queen charged Mr. Gladstone with the formation of a ministry December 2nd, and on December 5th he went down to Windsor with a provisional list of the Cabinet colleagues. His first act was to offer a place in the Cabinet, but without portfolio, to his old chief, Lord Russell, who declined it. The Cabinet, as eventually formed, was one of great individual ability. Lord Clarendon returned to the Foreign Office and remained there until his death, June 27th, 1870. Lord Granville led the House of Lords, first as Colonial and afterwards as Foreign Secretary. Sir Roundell Palmer, with one exception, the greatest of living lawyers, disapproved of the disendowment, though not of the disestablishment of the Church in Ireland. Preferring principle to place, he declined the woolsack, which was given to Sir W. Page Wood, Lord Hatherley. Earl de Grey and Ripon became President of the Council, Lord Kimberley, Lord Privy Seal, the Duke of Argyll, Secretary for India, and Lord Hartington, Postmaster General. Mr. Bruce went to the Home Office, Mr. Childers to the Admiralty, and Mr. Goshen to the Poor Law Board. But perhaps the most interesting appointments were Mr. Cardwell to the War Office, and Mr. Robert Lowe to the Exchequer, and Mr. Bright to the Board of Trade. The Premier was anxious to have Bright at the India Office, but he was with difficulty persuaded to take office at all, and 2 years later he was compelled, owing to ill health, to retire, not, however, before he had learnt to respect and admire his royal mistress, and had inspired her with similar sentiments toward himself. Mr. Chichester Fortescue, as Chief Secretary for Ireland, was included in the Cabinet. Lord Spencer, who became Lord Lieutenant, was not, nor was Mr. W. E. Forster, who, as Vice President of the Council, was to be responsible for one of the most important legislative achievements of the new government. If it be true that the death of Lord Palmerston marked the close of a great era in English history, it is not less true that a new epoch was opened by the election of the Parliament of 1868 and the formation of Mr. Gladstone's first Ministry. The personnel of the new House of Commons differed essentially from that which it displaced, reflecting the change wrought by the Act of 1867 in the electorate. Even more remarkable was the fact that the Act of 1832 was at last beginning to tell on the personnel of the executive. About half Mr. Gladstone's cabinet belonged to the class which had ruled England since 1688. It contained also one or two successful lawyers, but nearly half of the new cabinet were men of different tradition and environment. Goshen was personally a typical Oxonian, but in the councils of the nation he represented the city. Bright and Forster were admirable specimens of the northern manufacturers. Cardwell and Lowe were alike Wycombists, Oxonians, and barristers, but the latter's experience had been mainly colonial and journalistic, while Childers owed his reputation almost entirely to administrative work in Australia. "My mission," said Mr. Gladstone, on being summoned to power, "is to pacify Ireland." He embarked upon the mission with characteristic vehemence and vigour. He had already declared that the three branches of the Upas tree were the Church, the land, and education. To the first he applied the axe in the session of 1869. That he had received, in modern phrase, a mandate to deal with the established Church in Ireland is not open to question. His conduct in the session of 1868, the tone of his speeches in Lancashire and elsewhere, made it abundantly clear that if the electors gave him a majority he would use it in the first instance to disestablish and disendow the Irish Church. With the single exception of the general election of 1886, no contest has ever been fought on a more unclouded issue. It has been said that the Clerkenwell explosion sounded the knell of the Irish establishment. Mr. Gladstone himself partly admitted the impeachment. It has only been since the close of the American War and the appearance of Fenianism that the mind of the country has been greatly turned to the consideration of Irish affairs. But while admitting that it was the Fenian outrages which produced the attitude of attention and preparedness on the part of the whole population of this country which qualified them to embrace in a manner foreign to their habits in other times the vast importance of the Irish controversy, he vehemently denied that Fenianism had affected in the slightest degree his own convictions on the subject. Fenianism did, in fact, merely suggest the occasion. The causes of the problem now to be solved lay deep in the historic past. "The Irish Church," said Lord Lytton, "is the greatest Irish bull in the world." "There is," said Sidney Smith, "nothing like it in Europe, in Asia, in the discovered part of Africa, or in all we have heard of Timbuktu." Without accepting literally the dicta of professional humorists, it may be admitted that the position of the Irish establishment had always been anomalous. The Irish Reformation of the 16th century was a purely official movement. It corresponded to no interest or tradition on the part of the people. It did not even pretend to remedy a grievance or get rid of an abuse. From the first, Protestantism had been regarded by the mass of the Irish Celts as the symbol of Saxon ascendancy. It soon became associated with the policy of plantations. Of this association Oliver Cromwell was the personal embodiment. The two main pillars on which his Irish policy rested were Protestantism and plantation. The Orange conquests of 1691 accentuated and perpetuated the connection, but as regards the conversion of the Celt, The Whigs of the 18th century were no more successful than the Puritans of the 17th. Penal laws were as ineffective as plantations. More and more obtrusive did the anomaly become with the weakening of the spirit of religious bigotry. The Act of Union was the last chance for the Church of the minority. Had Pitt's whole policy been adopted instead of a mere torso, had tithe been abolished and the Roman Catholic laity been admitted to full political rights, had their clergy accepted concurrent endowment, Pitt's policy would have had a real chance of success. It took 30 years of agitation to secure tithe commutation and Catholic emancipation. And by then the time for concurrent endowment had already passed, if indeed it had ever been. Without some such scheme, the fate of the established Church was sealed. At no period probably did the Episcopalians in Ireland number more than 1 million. In 1868 they were said to number less than 700,000, not 1 in 8 of the whole population. In 199 parishes out of 2,428 there was said to be not a single Protestant Episcopalian. The Church of this minority enjoyed a revenue of about £614,000 a year. The 12 Protestant bishops in Ireland divided between them a net revenue of nearly £60,000. This was the condition of affairs when Mr. Gladstone laid his axe to the root of the tree. End of section 39. Section 40 of England since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 20, The Irish Question, Ecclesiastical, Agrarian, Political, Part 2. It was on March 1st, 1869, that the Prime Minister, in a speech of rare dignity, not to say solemnity, unfolded to the House his scheme for the disestablishment and partial disendowment of the established Church in Ireland. As from January 1st, 1871, the Irish Church was to be disestablished. Its connection with the English Church was to be dissolved. Its bishops were no longer to be represented in the House of Lords. All ecclesiastical corporations were to be abolished. Ecclesiastical courts were to cease, and ecclesiastical laws to be no longer binding. The Queen in Council was to have power to recognize a representative church body, which was to be elected by the clergy and laity and to be incorporated by charter. Disendowment was to take effect at once after the passing of the Act. The Ecclesiastical Commission was to be dissolved immediately, and the property of the Church secured by the Act was to be vested for 10 years in a new Commission of Church Temporalities. With vested interests, Mr. Gladstone proposed to deal equitably. All beneficed clergy, including bishops and other dignitaries, were to retain their net incomes for life, so long as they discharged their duties, or they might commute their income for a life annuity and relinquish their cures. Permanent curates were to be treated on the same principles, but transitory curates were to be dismissed with a gratuity. Such private endowments as had come to the Church since 1660 were to be handed over intact to the new commissioners. Churches actually in use, which the church body was willing to maintain for public worship, were to be handed over to them with the graveyards attached to the churches. A few, such as St. Patrick's Cathedral, partaking of the character of national memorials, were to be maintained by the commissioners. The glebe houses were, like the churches, to be vested in the church body, which was to repay the building charges upon them, amounting to £250,000. Glebe land might be purchased at a fair valuation. The Maynooth grant and the Regium Donum, or grant to Presbyterian ministers, were to be commuted for a sum of £1,100,000, on principles similar to those which governed the compensation to be paid to the clergy. The The tithe rent charge was to be purchased by the landlords under an ingenious arrangement which provided for the extinction of the charge in 45 years. The total value of church property Mr. Gladstone estimated at £16,000,000. Of this the bill disposed of £8,650,000, leaving a surplus of about £7,350,000, which was to be applied mainly to the relief of unavoidable calamity and suffering, yet not so far as to cancel or impair the obligations now attached to property under the Acts for the relief of the poor. Such were the outlines of Mr. Gladstone's carefully conceived and comprehensive scheme. It was attacked vigorously by Dr. Ball and Mr. Gathorne Hardy, and defended with genuine eloquence by Bright. But the debate as a whole was half-hearted. The bill was read a second time, March 24th, by 368 to 250, an unexpectedly large majority. It was through committee without substantial amendment before Whitsuntide, and on May 31st was read a third time by a majority of 114. Fortunate both as to weather and pilotage in its voyage through the Commons, the bill encountered heavy storms in the Lords. Much depended on the attitude of the bishops, and both the Queen and the Prime Minister had done their utmost to secure beforehand a favourable consideration at their hands. At Lord Granville's suggestion, the Queen had given an interview to Dr. Magee, an eloquent Irishman who had been promoted by Disraeli in 1868 to the see of Peterborough, and the Premier had, at the Queen's request, consulted the Primate. Fortunately for the Church, the Queen had insisted that the Archbishopric of Canterbury should be offered on the death of Archbishop Longley, October 1868, to Dr. Tate, then Bishop of London and previously Headmaster of Rugby. Dr. Tate was one of the greatest of post-Reformation archbishops, a man of genuine piety and profound learning, a proved administrator, a shrewd, cautious, broad-minded, and far-seeing statesman. He was barely seated in the chair of Augustine, February 1869, when he was called to confront a great issue. After the bill had passed the Commons, the Queen wrote both to Archbishop Tate and to Lord Derby, urging that the bill should not be opposed on second reading in the Lords. Her Majesty made no secret of her strong objection to the bill, but also foresaw the probable consequences of rejection. Carried as it has been by an overwhelming and steady majority through a House of Commons chosen expressly to speak the feeling of the country on the question, there seems no reason to believe that any fresh appeal to the people would lead to a different result. The rejection of the bill, therefore, would only serve to bring the two Houses into collision and to prolong a dangerous agitation on the subject. In her constitutional instincts and political perceptions the Queen was rarely at fault, but some of the lay peers were obdurate and determined, June 5th, to try to defeat the bill on second reading. The debate was maintained at a high level even for the House of Lords. The most notable contributors to the debate were Dr. Thirlwall, the learned Bishop of St. David's, and the only prelate who voted for the bill. Two seceders from Lord Derby's last cabinet, Lord Salisbury and Lord Carnarvon, who refused to vote against it, a great Irish lawyer, Lord Cairns, and a great Irish churchman, Bishop Magee. The debate was characterized not only by elevation of thought, but by independence of argument. Dr. Magee, for example, derided the argument that the bill was a violation of the Queen's coronation oath or the Act of Union. Either might surely be modified by the assent of the parties. Lord Cairns, on the contrary, held that it was impossible to abrogate a single essential clause of the Act of Union without abrogating the whole. Both, however, concurred in the belief that the bill would do nothing to pacify Ireland. It would exasperate the Protestants, the Catholics it would gratify but not pacify. The Irish peasant, said the bishop, has already given his answer to your offer of pacification, pacification which consists in refusing him the land which he does want, and giving him the destruction of the Church which he does not. The Roman Catholic population of Ireland, said Lord Cairns, merely look upon the destruction of the establishment as a preliminary to the destruction of the landlords. How truly they both diagnosed the situation the sequel will tell. On June 19th, however, in a House of 325, the second reading was carried by a majority of 33. But the bill was no sooner in committee than it encountered stormy waters. In the amendments which were proposed and carried, the opponents of the bill concentrated on 2 points. Number 1, better financial terms for the Church, and Number 2, such an alteration of the preamble as would permit the surplus to be devoted to concurrent endowment instead of to secular purposes. Archbishop Tait asked for an extra £3 million to float the new church upon, and the House of Lords gave him more. The effect of the amendments with which the bill returned to the House of Commons was, according to Gladstone, to give the disestablished Irish Church an additional solatium of nearly 4 millions. Relying largely for support on Scotch Presbyterians, English and Welsh Nonconformists, and Irish Roman Catholics, Gladstone dared not to have accepted the amendment even if he would. After much negotiation, he agreed to give the Church an extra £280,000 and some minor concessions, but struck out the principle of concurrent endowment. The Lords refused to give way, and a deadlock seemed to be imminent. That it was ultimately averted was due to the genial and skilful diplomacy of Lord Granville, to the courage and good sense of Lord Cairns, and above all to the untiring efforts of the Queen. Her Majesty insisted that negotiations between the Premier and the Primate should be reopened through Dr. Wellesley, Dean of Windsor, and at the height of the crisis Lord Cairns, though doubtful as to the support of his party, sought and obtained a private interview with Lord Granville. Mr. Gladstone's patience was exhausted, and had his will prevailed, the bill would have been abandoned. Lord Granville, however, was determined to find a way out. With the help of Lord Cairns he found it. The surplus was to be used for the relief of unavoidable calamity, but in such manner as Parliament would hereafter direct, and the Church got further pecuniary concession, the precise money value of which is very variously estimated. The bill received the royal assent on July 26th. No sooner had the bill become law than the friends of the disestablished Church set to work with a will to prepare for the inevitable and to reorganize the Church. A representative Church body was at once formed and duly incorporated. Fortunately, it was able to command the services not only of men of piety, but of men of business, and in all recent Irish history there is nothing more remarkable than the wisdom and skill with which this body has evolved order out of chaos and has saved and reaccumulated for the Church it serves a not inconsiderable proportion of its wealth. That the results of disestablishment to the Church in Ireland have been in many respects bracing and invigorating cannot be denied. Its sphere of usefulness has been curtailed, but within that contracted sphere its activity has been conspicuous and its zeal untiring. To what extent has it fulfilled the expectations of its author in regard to Catholic and Celtic Ireland? Has it healed wounds and assuaged bitterness? In this regard it must be admitted that fulfilment had been vouched not to the hopes of Mr. Gladstone, but to the predictions of Lord Cairns and Bishop Magee. On its merits there was much to be said even by the admission of opponents for the Act of 1869, but as a measure of pacification it failed. It would be unfair to lay too much stress upon the prevalence of lawlessness and serious crime in Ireland during the later months of the year. Nor was it surprising that the release of a considerable batch of Fenian prisoners, so far from being accepted as an act of clemency and goodwill, was derided as a sign of weakness. Nevertheless, there was justification for the fears expressed by Cairns and Magee. The disendowment of the Church proved to be the prelude for the reopening of an agrarian agitation which convulsed Ireland for a quarter of a century. About the Anglican Church few people knew more than Mr. Gladstone. About Irish land tenure few people knew less. Yet, as regards Ireland, the latter question was infinitely the more important. The question of central and paramount interest in Ireland is today, as it has been for some centuries past, that of the land. Thus wrote one who knew Ireland as few men have known it, and who used language with the accuracy of a great scholar. Mr. Gladstone was, of course, conscious of this truth, and took infinite pains to equip himself for the task to which he now turned his hand, but despite the best intentions, the results, as the sequel will show, were not commensurate with the effort involved, and for a simple reason. Knowing little of Ireland at first hand himself, he was curiously impatient of the advice of those who knew much. His agrarian legislation, therefore, was a progressive series of disappointments. It was the publication of the report of the Devon Commission in 1845 which first made Englishmen realize that there existed in Ireland an agrarian problem which urgently demanded the attention of the imperial legislature. The Irish land system, like much else in Ireland, was the result of the superimposition of English ideas upon an arrested native development. Early in the 17th century, the English lawyers, by a stroke of the pen, substituted the principles of English land law for the traditional customs which prevailed in Ireland. The root blunder made by the English lawyers lay in regarding an Irish tribal chieftain as the proprietor of the soil tilled by the tribesmen. This initial blunder was never eradicated, nor even until the close of the 19th century repaired. The confiscations and plantations of the 17th century all proceeded on the erroneous assumption that the chieftain was a landlord. Not until the Devon Report did Englishmen begin to suspect that the Irish land system differed fundamentally from their own, that the ordinary contractual relations of landlord and tenant, as understood in England, were entirely opposed to the genius of the Irish system, that improvements were commonly effected, not as in England by the landlord, but by the tenant, and that partly by virtue of those improvements, partly by immemorial tradition, the tenant regarded himself as possessed of customary rights in the soil which he tilled. The report of the Bessborough Commission did not go beyond the facts in stating there has in general survived to the Irish farmer, through all vicissitudes, in despite of the seeming or real veto of the law, an apparent defiance of political economy, a living tradition of possessory rights, such as belong in the more primitive ages of society to the status of the man who tilled the soil. This living tradition was first broken by the famine and by the Encumbered Estates Act. The latter, as we have seen, went far to substitute for the old proprietors, not less imbued with the living tradition than the tenants, a new race of commercial landlords who brought to the business of landowning the ethics and economics of the Manchester school. From this moment the acute difficulties began. Mr. Cardwell's Land Act of 1860 represented the attempt of one of the most capable of Peel's disciples to indoctrinate the Irish land system with the principle of free trade. In the forefront of the Act it was asserted that the relation of landlord and tenant shall be deemed to be founded on the express or implied contract of the parties, and not upon tenure or service. But the Act of 1860 was a dead failure. So far as it was operative at all, it tended to encourage evictions and to embitter the relations of owner and occupier. The Act of 1870 was conceived on entirely different lines. It was intended to effect four main objects. Number one, to deter the landlord from exercising a right of capricious eviction by giving the tenant compensation for disturbance. Number two, to give the force of law to the Ulster custom of tenant right, wherever such custom was recognizable. Number three, to secure to the outgoing tenant compensation for unexhausted improvements effected by himself or his predecessor in title. And number four, by what were known as the Bright Clauses, to facilitate purchase on the part of the tenants. The bill passed both Houses with a modicum of opposition, but some of the best Irish opinion deplored the fact that no attempt was made either to provide against arbitrary raising of the rent or to define the respective rights of owner and occupier. The purchase clauses, popularly and rightly associated with the name of Bright, were unfortunately clogged with such complicated conditions as to render them practically inoperative. Nevertheless, it was on the lines suggested by Bright, not on those laid down by Gladstone, that the solution of the problem was ultimately to be found. It is not without significance that long before the Land Bill emerged from committee, an Act for the suppression of crime in Ireland should have been rapidly passed through both Houses. The first effects of the stirring of the stagnant slough of Irish despond by the dredge of legislation had been to bring all the mud and refuse to the surface at once. It was truly said, and not less true was Lord Salisbury's comment in the course of the debate: "You must teach the Irish people to fear the law before you can induce them to like it." The Peace Preservation Act of 1870 forbade the use of firearms in any district proclaimed by the Lord Lieutenant, required a licence for the possession of arms under any circumstances, and gave powers to the police to make domiciliary visits, to search for arms or for evidence as to threatening letters, and to arrest any person wandering about at night in a suspicious manner. It also authorized a change of venue in trials where justice was likely to be impeded by local prejudice, authorized the grand jury, with the consent of the judge, to levy damages on the district for compensation in cases of agrarian murder, gave increased powers of summary jurisdiction to magistrates, and empowered the executive to suppress any newspaper which lent itself to intimidation. So general was the conviction as to the necessity for strengthening the administration of the law in Ireland that only 15 members opposed the bill on the second reading, and on April 4th it became an act. Before the close of the year, however, Mr. Gladstone thought it well to temper justice with mercy by granting an amnesty to the Fenian prisoners who still remained in penal servitude, though the amnesty was coupled with the condition of banishment from the United Kingdom for life. Firmness, mercy, and generosity seemed alike impotent to secure the peace and good government of Ireland. Hardly 6 months had elapsed after the passing of the Land Bill before Lord Hartington, who had become Chief Secretary in January 1871, moved for a select committee to inquire into the state of County Westmeath and other adjacent districts. The prevalence of agrarian crime more than justified inquiry, and the fact that the crime was a result of organized conspiracy rendered the situation doubly serious. "The reports which we receive," said Lord Hartington, "show that such a state of terrorism prevails that the Ribbon Society had only to issue its edict to secure obedience. Ribbon law, and not the law of the land, appears to be that which is obeyed. It exerts such power that no landlord dare exercise the commonest rights of property, no farmer or other employer dare exercise his own judgment or discretion as to whom he shall employ. In fact, so far does the influence of the society extend that a man scarcely dare enter into open competition in the fairs or markets with anyone known to belong to the society." Such language was less familiar to the Parliament of 1871 than it has unhappily become. The committee was readily granted, and as a result of its inquiries the Westmeath Act was passed. Authority was given to the Lord Lieutenant to proclaim a district, to suspend the Habeas Corpus Act for 2 years in any such district, and by warrant to commit for trial suspected persons who were arrested in other parts of Ireland if they had been in a proclaimed district since January 1st. The operation of the Act was limited to 2 years, but at the same time the peace preservation was continued. With 2 factors of the Irish problem Gladstone had now dealt. There remained the third, the constitutional factor. On May 19th, 1870, Mr. Isaac Butt and others inaugurated at a meeting held at the Bilton Hotel, Dublin, the Home Government Association of Ireland. The association was formed to obtain for our country the right and privilege of managing our own affairs by a Parliament assembled in Ireland, composed of Her Majesty the Sovereign and her successors and the Lords and Commons of Ireland, to secure for that Parliament, under a federal arrangement, the right of legislating for and regulating all matters relating to the internal affairs of Ireland, and control over Irish resources and revenues, subject to the obligation of contributing our just proportion of the imperial expenditure, to leave to an imperial Parliament the power of dealing with all questions affecting the imperial crown and government, legislation regarding the colonies and other dependencies of the crown, the relations of the United Empire with foreign states, and all matters appertaining to the defence and stability of the empire at large, to attain such an adjustment of the relations between the two countries without any interference with the prerogatives of the crown or any disturbance of the principles of the Constitution. It has seemed well to record the ipsissima verba of the more important resolutions adopted at the Dublin meeting of 1870, for that meeting was the cradle of the Home Rule movement. The association soon showed its practical efficacy. In 1871 and 1872 there were in Ireland 12 by-elections, in 8 of which the Home Rule candidates were successful, and in this way Isaac Butt and Mitchell Henry, Mr. Blennerhassett and Colonel Nolan found themselves in the House of Commons, a nucleus of a new party. In 1873 a conference was held in Dublin to organize the forces of the new movement for the approaching general election. It was then and there that the Home Government Association was transformed into the Home Rule League. Upon the new movement inaugurated by Butt, Gladstone poured undiluted scorn. Can any sensible man, can any rational man, he asked, suppose that at this time of day, in this condition of the world, we are going to disintegrate the great capital institutions of the country for the purpose of making ourselves ridiculous in the sight of all mankind, and crippling any power we possess for bestowing benefits through legislation on the country to which we belong? Gladstone himself was by this time intent upon another piece of work for Ireland, the reorganization of higher education. It stood badly in need of it. Since Sir Robert Peel's day nothing effectual had been done. In 1848 Peel had established the godless colleges at Cork, Galway and Belfast, and in 1850 these colleges were affiliated into the Queen's University of Ireland. But into the soil of Catholic Ireland the new institution never struck roots, and in 1851 the Catholic bishops in the Synod of Turles formally condemned the mixed system. 3 years later a Catholic university was established under the presidency of John Henry Newman, and for years was maintained entirely by Catholic piety, unassisted by the state. Not until 1873 was any serious attempt made to deal on broad lines with the thorny question of university education for the Irish Catholics. Mr. Gladstone's bill was founded upon 2 propositions which could hardly be disputed. Number 1, that the condition of the Irish Catholics in respect of university education was scandalously bad, and number 2, that the Queen's colleges had been a comparative failure. Mr. Gladstone therefore proposed to abolish the Queen's University altogether and to metamorphose the University of Dublin. Of late years the latter had contained but one college, the famous foundation of Trinity. Henceforth it was to be, not in name only, but in fact, matrix collegiorum, and to it were to be affiliated Trinity College, the Queen's Colleges at Belfast and Cork, the Catholic University College, and other colleges. The new university was to have both teaching and examining functions. It was to be the sole degree-giving body in Ireland, and to be liberally endowed, partly from the revenues of Trinity College, but there were to be no chairs of theology, moral philosophy, or modern history. The scheme was assailed from every quarter. English nonconformists objected to state aid for denominational teaching. Irish Protestants denounced the disendowment of Trinity College and attacked the endowment of error. Catholics in both countries were firmly opposed, then, as always, to a mixed system of education. As to the parliamentary history of the bill and its effects upon the fortunes of the Ministry, something will be said later. Its defeat on the second reading was regretted by few. The measure was framed with perverse ingenuity so as to wound every susceptibility and to disturb every existing institution without satisfying a single grumbler and without removing a single grievance. A much less pretentious measure introduced and passed by Disraeli in 1879 achieved a degree of success beyond all expectation. Like so many ministries before it, Mr. Gladstone's famous administration of 1868 was doomed to go to pieces on the Irish rocks. Not, however, before it had passed into law an extraordinary number of legislative projects and had effected administrative changes of far-reaching significance. To this tale of administrative and legislative work the next chapters must be devoted. End of section 40. Section 41 of England since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21. National Education, Part 1. We must induce our masters to learn their letters. Mr. Lowe's aphorism will be remembered and quoted long after his incisive arraignment of democracy has faded into oblivion. The following pages will disclose the first serious attempt made by the State to follow his sage advice. That attempt will be associated to all time with the name of Mr. William Edward Forster, Vice President of the Council in Mr. Gladstone's first Ministry, but not until July 1870 a member of the Cabinet. Mr. Forster introduced his famous bill on February 17, 1870. Before we examine its provisions and follow its parliamentary fortunes, it may be advisable to repair a deliberate omission and cast a brief retrospective glance over the history of elementary education in England. It is a fact not without significance that the first State grant in aid of elementary education was made the year after the first great Reform Bill became law. Down to 1833, the work of educating the children of the poor in England had devolved wholly upon the churches. Something was done by this meagre dole to improve matters, but not much, and in 1839 Lord John Russell expressed the concern of Her Majesty at the want of instruction which is still observable among the poorer classes of her subjects. All the enquiries which have been made show, he added, a deficiency in the general education of the people, which is not in accordance with the character of a civilized and Christian nation. Lord Melbourne's government decided, therefore, to set up what was in effect a new administrative department, though technically a committee of the Privy Council on Education. They increased the Treasury grant from £20,000 to £30,000 and made a beginning with the appointment of an inspectorate. The inspectors were of two kinds. Number 1, clergymen of the Church of England appointed under the sanction of the Archbishop of Canterbury to inspect church schools and reporting in duplicate to the Archbishop and to the committee, and Number 2, laymen appointed under the sanction of the British and Foreign School Society to inspect and report upon their schools. But the root of the difficulty lay in the lack of trained and efficient teachers. Almost the only teachers, wrote Matthew Arnold, whom the Committee of Council found at its disposal in 1839, were either untrained men who, from some defect of body and health, had been driven from the rougher struggles of life and muscular toil, or self-taught Sunday school teachers trained for 3 or 6 months in some central model school, such, for instance, as the British and Foreign School Society had established in the Borough Road. Lord John Russell had in 1839 proposed to establish a government normal school for the training of teachers, but so fierce was the opposition of the Church party that Lord Melbourne's ministry was all but wrecked, and the proposal had to be withdrawn. 4 years later, the Nonconformists had their revenge. Sir James Graham's Factory Act of 1843 originally contained a provision for the establishment of state-aided schools in manufacturing districts. The religious teaching was to be in accordance with the tenets of the established Church, though Nonconformists were to be protected by a conscience clause. But the latter would have none of it, and the clauses were deleted. Nevertheless, although Russell failed to establish a government training college, his proposal had the effect of stimulating voluntary effort, and by 1851 25 such institutions had been established. By 1846 the Treasury grant had risen to £100,000, and the minutes of that year necessitated still further increase. The remuneration and prospects of the teachers were much improved. A system of apprenticeship or pupil teachers was inaugurated, and provision was made for improving the normal schools and the training of teachers. So rapidly, indeed, did expenditure increase that in 1858 it was thought well to appoint a commission under the chairmanship of the Duke of Newcastle to inquire into the present state of popular education in England. The commission reported in 1861, and it fell to Robert Lowe to carry into effect its main recommendations. The commissioners gave due credit to the results of voluntary effort, and in particular they emphasized the debt due to the labours and self-sacrifice of the clergy. They recommended an increase of state grants to properly inspected schools, that inspection should take the form of individual examination, and that the Treasury grant should be based upon the results of examination. Only by payment by results could the efficiency of the elementary teaching of every scholar be, in their opinion, secured. Lowe's Revised Code of 1861 gave effect to this principle. Henceforward the grant was to be earned only by approved schools taught by a certified teacher. It was to be paid to managers who were to be responsible for the appointment and remuneration of the teachers. The pupils were to be required to make a certain number of attendances, and the amount of the grant was to depend upon the result of the individual examination of the pupils in the 3 elementary subjects, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Mr. Lowe was at once an economist and a humorist. "I cannot," he said, in introducing his scheme to the House of Commons, "promise you either efficiency or cheapness, but if the system is not efficient, it will be cheap. If it is not cheap, it will be efficient." The system of payment by results thus introduced was bitterly assailed by educational experts, notably by one of the most eminent inspectors who ever served the committee, Matthew Arnold. The government so far gave way as to allow 1/3 of the grant to be reckoned by individual attendances, and 2/3 to depend upon the results of examination, but the principle survived for many years. Long before its final decease, its enemies had multiplied and its friends diminished. Nevertheless, much progress was made in the decades which followed upon the Newcastle Commission. Between 1861 and 1870, various attempts at legislation were made from both sides of the House, but until Mr. Gladstone's advent to power, nothing effectual was accomplished. By that time, people were gradually awakening to the folly of entrusting the political destinies of the country to the manual workers, without taking the precaution that they should be reasonably educated. The ground, therefore, was prepared for Mr. Forster, and the seed he flung into it was good. The first problem to be solved is how can we cover the country with good schools. No elaboration of phrase would have been so effective as the direct and simple words with which Mr. Forster introduced his great measure of 1870. To the solution of this problem he bent all the capacities of a powerful intellect, a dogged will, and a transparently simple and open mind. Forster had no arrière-pensée whatever in framing his bill of 1870. He did not desire to strike a backhanded blow at any church or institution. His one and only object was to give to the children of the poor the education they lacked, and thus lay securely the foundations of the democratic state to come. Our object is to complete the present voluntary system, to fill up gaps, sparing the public money where it can be done without, procuring as much as we rightly can the assistance of the parents, and welcoming as much as we rightly can the cooperation and aid of those benevolent men who desire to assist their neighbours. The main provisions of the scheme were as follows. The whole of England and Wales were to be divided exhaustively into school districts, and its educational needs and existing facilities to be accurately ascertained. Each district was to have sufficient public school accommodation for elementary scholars. If in any one of the districts we find the elementary education to be sufficient, efficient, and suitable, we let it alone so long as it continues in that state. All schools were to be open to government inspection and governed by the code. The ordinary fee was not to exceed 9d. a week. When the supply of voluntary schools was defective, a school board with power to levy a rate was to be set up. The board was to be elected in the towns by the town council, in rural districts by the vestry. The cost of board schools was to be borne in equal proportions by the parents, by the state, and by the local rates. A local rate was not likely to come near 3d. in the pound, a singularly unwise attempt to prophesy. In specially poor districts, the boards were to have power to establish free schools, and in any district they might pay the fees of very poor parents without any stigma of pauperism applying to such payment. So far all was tolerably plain sailing. There remained, however, two knotty questions to be decided. Was elementary education to be compulsory? And what was to be the place in the curriculum of religious instruction? Both difficulties were transferred to the shoulders of the local authorities. The school boards were to be authorized, though not compelled, to frame bylaws for the compulsory attendance of all children in the district between the ages of 5 and 12. The penalty for non-attendance was not to exceed 5 shillings, and not to be imposed if reasonable excuses were forthcoming, or if there were no school within a mile. As to religious teaching, the boards, subject in every case to a stringent conscience clause, were to have entire discretion. They might provide any or none. The bill as a whole was received with general approval, but round the question of religious teaching the battle raged hotly. The Birmingham League, an association of extreme radicals, had pronounced in favour of the dogma that education should be free, compulsory, and secular. On no single point was Forster willing to make concession to these doctrinaires. Among them were his own colleagues in the representation of Bradford, Mr. Edward Miall, Mr. Henry Richard, a prominent liberationist, and Mr. George Dixon, one of the members for Birmingham. Such men were bitterly disappointed to find that the authors of the bill had been so exclusively concerned for the welfare of the children as to neglect the opportunity of striking an oblique blow at the Church of England. Forster himself they regarded as a renegade, and they pursued him in his measure with undeviating hostility. Mr. Dixon moved, on the second reading, an amendment to the effect that no measure for the elementary education of the people could afford a permanent and satisfactory settlement which left the important question of religious instruction to be determined by the local authorities. And so threatening did the attitude of the dissenters become that Mr. Gladstone deemed it prudent to promise that the government would not press the points to which special objection was taken until after full consideration in committee. 3 months elapsed after the second reading before the committee stage was reached, June 16th. The opposition of the dissenters to the bill centred on 2 points: the inadequacy of a conscience clause to prevent the virtual re-endowment of Anglicanism in the board schools, and the danger of leaving entire discretion to the school boards as to rate aid for voluntary schools. On going into committee, Mr. Gladstone at once announced some important concessions. The most important was the acceptance of Mr. Cooper Temple's amendment, which provided, number 1, that no catechism or formulary distinctive of any denominational creed should be taught in any board school, and number 2, that no voluntary school should receive assistance from the rates. To soften the blow to the latter, the state grant to all schools, board or voluntary, was increased from 1/3 to 1/2. At the same time, the conscience clause was strengthened by the introduction of a timetable which, by making religious instruction, if and when provided, the first lesson of the day, rendered it easier for parents to withdraw, or rather to withhold, their children from such instruction. The age for compulsory attendance was raised from 12 to 13, and the principle of direct election by the ratepayers was substituted for indirect election by town councils and vestries. Voting was to be cumulative and by ballot. The Birmingham party would gladly have postponed all educational reform in the hope of converting the House and the country to their own extreme views. Mr. Lowe aptly compared the attitude of extremists on both sides to that of a fine herd of cattle in a large meadow, deserting the rich grass which is abundant around them, and delighting themselves by fighting over a bed of nettles in one corner of the field. In the end, however, good sense prevailed. The principal amendment, moved on behalf of the Birmingham party by Mr. Richard, was defeated by 421 to 60, and with the amendments noted above, the bill went through committee, was read a third time on July 22nd, and on August 9th received the royal assent. The Act of 1870 was one of the most splendid legislative achievements of the century. For his share in it, the giant's share, Mr. Forster received a vote of censure from his constituents at Bradford, and earned the unrelenting hostility of a section of his political friends. But he had the supreme satisfaction of knowing that he had laid broad and deep the foundations of a truly national system of elementary education. The citizen rulers of the greatest empire the world has seen were at last to be taught their letters. The quickening of educational activity was immediately apparent. In 1870 there were about 9,000 state-aided schools in England and Wales, with about 1,300,000 scholars in average attendance. During the next decade, the voluntary schools increased to 14,370, and 3,692 board schools came into existence with an aggregate of nearly 3 million children in average attendance. Since 1870, there have been two important legislative changes in regard to elementary education, while administration has been modified and adapted year by year under the annual code. In 1876, Lord Sandon, as Vice President of the Education Committee in Disraeli's ministry, carried an act of considerable importance. It placed restrictions on juvenile appointment, whereby no child might be employed at all under the age of 10, and not until the age of 14 without a certificate of educational proficiency. It set up school attendance committees in every district where no school boards existed. It gave to these committees, equally with the school boards, the power to frame bylaws enforcing compulsory attendance, and it repealed the provision in the Act of 1870 authorizing school boards to pay the fees in certain cases. Instead of this, parents were permitted to obtain the fees for their children from the guardians of the poor, without incurring the disabilities of pauperism. The Act of 1876 marked a distinct step on the road toward compulsion. In 1880, under Mr. Mundella's guidance, the goal was reached, and local authorities were not merely permitted, but obliged to frame bylaws to enforce attendance. Further steps were taken by Sir William Hart Dyke, who was Minister of Education in Lord Salisbury's administration, 1886 to 1892. The Code of 1890 made it possible to establish evening continuation schools, payment on the results of individual examinations was abolished, and there was substituted for it a block grant reckoned on the basis of average attendances. In the following year, 1891, a still more important change was effected. The fees paid by the parents were abolished, and the State undertook to make good the deficiency estimated at that time at £2 million a year. Thus, elementary education became not only compulsory, but gratuitous, or rather the charge was transferred from individual parents to the community at large. The change, due mainly to Mr. Goschen inside the Cabinet and Mr. Chamberlain outside it, was criticized at the time and is still a matter of controversy. It was said that the pence were hardly worth collecting and that gratuitous service was the natural corollary of compulsion. Neither plea was conclusive, and neither perhaps would have prevailed but for the fears of the Church party, that if the change were delayed it would be effected by their opponents, and in such a way as to extinguish the voluntary schools. That the apprehension was a natural one can hardly be denied. Whether it was sufficient to justify the step taken by the Conservative Government of 1891 is more arguable. End of section 41. Section 42 of England Since Waterloo by John Arthur Ransome Marriott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21, National Education, Part 2. The problem of elementary education does not, of course, stand alone. The solution attained by the Acts of 1870, 1876, 1880, and 1891 may indeed in one sense be said to have intensified and complicated the educational problem as a whole. Elementary education, as a great scholar once said, unless crowned by something higher, is not only barren but may even be dangerous. It is not well to teach our democracy to read unless we also teach it to think. It was proper, therefore, that the generation which tackled the problem of primary education should have taken thought also for secondary and higher education. To this large question, however, limitations of space will permit only the most jejune reference. In 1861 a commission was appointed under the chairmanship of Lord Clarendon to inquire into the condition of the 9 chief grammar schools of the country, known distinctively as the public schools. Of these, the 7 boarding schools were brought under the operation of the Public Schools Act of 1868, Eton, Winchester, Westminster, Charterhouse, Harrow, Rugby, and Shrewsbury. New governing bodies were appointed and much needed reforms of constitution and curriculum were effected. Nor were the beneficial results of government inquiry confined to the selected schools. They extended to many other secondary schools such as St. Paul's, Merchant Taylor's, Repton, Uppingham, Marlborough, Wellington, and Clifton, which with several others take rank among the great public schools. But the vast improvement effected in such schools touched only the fringe of the problem of secondary education. In 1865 a commission, of which Lord Taunton was chairman and Dr. Temple the most active member, was appointed to inquire into the education given in secondary schools, included neither in the purview of the Public Schools Commission nor in that of the Newcastle Commission of 1859. They found at work 572 endowed grammar schools with a net income of £183,066, and exhibitions of the annual value of £13,897, besides some 10,000 private schools. As a result of their report issued in 1867, the Endowed Schools Act of 1869 was passed. 3 commissioners were appointed to draw up schemes for the revision of the educational trusts of some 3,000 schools. The result of their labors was a very extensive resettlement for the benefit of secondary education of charitable trusts involving an income of over £600,000 a year. But although under the Acts of 1868 and 1869 existing educational funds were applied to better purposes, little was done towards evolving a coherent system of secondary education for the nation at large. The first really effective step in this direction was taken by the Act which in 1888 established county councils. The Technical Instruction Act was passed in 1889 and gave power to the councils of counties and boroughs to supply or aid in supplying technical and manual instruction, and for this purpose to levy a rate not exceeding 1 penny in the pound. In the following year there fell to these authorities a veritable windfall in the shape of the beer and whisky money. Under the Local Taxation Act of 1890 an additional tax was imposed on spirits, and the proceeds of this and part of the existing tax on beer were to be applied to compensation for the extinction of publicans' licenses. Parliament was unwilling to appropriate it to the latter purpose, and in the event the greater part of the money, amounting to over £500,000 a year, was placed at the disposal of the local authorities, with a strong hint that they should apply it to technical education. Most of the councils took the hint. The term technical was generously interpreted by the central authority, and the whisky money thus provided the means by which something like a coherent system of secondary education has been gradually evolved. In the work of improving secondary education, the universities have played a not unimportant part. The system of local examinations established by Oxford and Cambridge in 1858 has immensely improved the standard of teaching in thousands of middle-class schools, and in 1873 the two universities established a joint board which has devised a system of examination for secondary schools of the highest grade. Certificates granted in connection with the local and joint board examinations exempt successful candidates from various professional and other examinations and from the preliminary examinations at the universities themselves. The attentions of the educational reformer were not confined to primary and secondary instruction. For many years past, the position of things at the universities had been in the highest degree anomalous. Oxford, in particular, ever since the restrictive legislation of the 16th and 17th centuries, had been narrowed into an exclusively Church of England institution. After the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts in 1828 and the passing of the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829 and the Reform Act of 1832, the injustice of the situation was increasingly felt. There were now many nonconformists admitted not merely to the legislature, but to a place in the inner councils of the empire, to whom the highest education was obstinately denied. At Oxford, both matriculation and graduation were burdened with a religious test. At Cambridge, nonconformists might matriculate, reside, and offer themselves for examination, but they could not proceed to a degree. For 20 years an assault was maintained against the barriers erected by Elizabethan and Caroline legislation. Mr. Gladstone consistently maintained the view that the universities were undoubtedly national institutions, but only in so far as they were connected with the national church. Even in 1850 he insisted that, as matters now stand, there is not the shadow or the pretext of a case for inquiry. But Lord John Russell thought otherwise, and in 1850 two royal commissions were appointed to inquire into the state, discipline, studies, and revenues of the University and colleges of Oxford and Cambridge respectively. The reports of these commissions and the resulting legislation mark an epoch of first-rate importance in national education. In the forefront of the Oxford report there was an emphatic assertion of the national character of the university. Such an institution cannot be regarded as a mere aggregation of private interests. It is eminently national. It would seem, therefore, to be a matter of public policy that such measures should be taken as may serve to raise its efficiency to the highest point and to diffuse its benefit most widely. Many of the resulting reforms were primarily domestic in character, affecting the constitution and powers of the governing bodies within the university: convocation, congregation, and council. Others were intended to facilitate the admission of a poorer class of students by giving permission to undergraduates to reside in licensed lodgings, or even to become members of the university without incurring the expense of joining a college or hall. Of even wider significance were those which permitted dissenters to matriculation and the bachelor's degree at Oxford, 1854, and which at Cambridge abolished the test for all degrees except those in divinity. But at both universities dissenters were still excluded from all share in the government and virtually from all part in the teaching work alike of the universities and of the colleges, as well as from the enjoyment of the more permanent emoluments. Between 1860 and 1870 there was almost continuous agitation for the complete and final abolition of all such restrictions, and on several occasions attempts were made to legislate in this sense. Of such legislation Mr. Gladstone was the most powerful opponent. It was, he declared in 1863, a fair and just demand on the part of the Church of England that the governing body in her university and her colleges should be composed of her members. But in 1865 Oxford unmuzzled her champion, and as member for Greenwich he carried the sweeping legislation of 1871. The Act of that year abolished all religious tests at Oxford and Cambridge, except in the case of college headships and clerical fellowships, and of theological chairs and degrees in divinity. The principles of the Act of 1871 were enlarged still further by the executive commissions appointed at Lord Salisbury's instance in 1876. By these commissions, whose functions extended over several years, the universities and their colleges, their degrees, prizes, and endowments, their offices and their government, were opened freely to all creeds and classes. Apart from the removal of the tests, the principal changes effected were the limitation of the tenure of the ordinary fellowships to 7 years, the abolition of restrictions upon marriage, the equalization in the value of college scholarships, and the application of college endowments to the increase and a higher remuneration of the professoriate and other university purposes. Mr. Jowett and others urged upon the Commission to enlarge the principle of local examinations and to make provision for the extension of university teaching to persons beyond the limits of the university. Cambridge had already made a beginning in this direction in 1873, and Oxford followed suit. The ancient universities thus showed themselves no longer content to be only, in the strict sense of the phrase, seats of learning. They now desire to be mother cities of intellectual colonies, and to spread the influence of their teaching throughout the land. This colonizing movement undertaken by the older universities prepared the way for another remarkable development in higher education, the foundation of universities and university colleges in London and many of the great provincial towns. University colleges were established in London in 1828, and in 1836 the University of London came into existence as a degree-giving institution. In 1898 it was transformed into a teaching university. The Owens College, Manchester, the nucleus of the Victoria University, was founded in 1851. The Newcastle College of Science, in connection with the University of Durham, in 1871, and during the next 30 years similar colleges were established at Leeds, Bristol, Sheffield, Birmingham, Nottingham, Liverpool, Reading, Southampton, Bangor, Cardiff, and Aberystwyth. From every point of view, therefore, the second half of the 19th century was fruitful in educational activity. In 1850, higher education was a preserve of Anglicanism, secondary education was simply chaotic, and primary education reached only a small proportion of the children of the poor. Before the close of the century, the old universities were completely nationalized. Colleges of university rank were springing up in great centres of industry. A coherent and comprehensive system of intermediate education was being gradually evolved, and primary instruction, without payment and without price, was within the reach of all. More important still, the different educational grades no longer existed in isolation. They were closely correlated, and for the boy or girl of promise, the transition from one grade to the other was rendered easy and cheap. The nation had learnt the lesson that of all forms of national waste, the most extravagant is the waste of brains. End of Section 42.